Hey Matt,
Hey Sanjay, how are you?
I'm good. Long time no see. How are you?
Good. Things have been probably about the same here since you've since you departed. Where are you
Yeah.
at now? Are you back in Cambridge or
No, I'm in Richmond, Virginia. Yeah, another research trip.
nice? Well, well, all right. Um, Welcome to the last of this summer's research forums. We need to start scheduling again, so I guess we'll be resuming probably in September in the early fall. So today it's a really nice chance to sort of talk with two researchers who were here last year. Time goes very fast. Jared Asser and Sanjay Paul about their research that they were doing here in Wilson Library. As before, the format of this discussion is pretty set in stone. Jared will speak first for a half hour. Then I'll introduce Sanjay. He'll speak for a half hour. Then we'll come back together, and it'll give us a chance to have some questions and discuss what they've presented for us today. And you can ask questions in a variety of ways. You can raise your hand, and I'm happy to read what you've written in the chat, or of course you can speak yourselves. So let's just begin. Today it's going to be Jared first. Um, Jared was kind enough to share a short bio with me, and I just want to read this, that Jared is a doctoral candidate at the University of Georgia, where he works on the cultural history of the U.S. South. Jared's dissertation interprets how Southerners used emotions to navigate the political crises of the Reconstruction period. His work has been supported by 7 external grants, including Wilson Library and the Virginia Museum of History and Culture. And outside of his dissertation, he's writing a book chapter on the history of race and anger in the 19th century. Um, that sounds fascinating, actually. That seems very uh, it's neat how that dovetails both into your dissertation and as your dissertation sort of proposal reads into our current times. So, Jared, welcome, and we really look forward to hearing about your work here.
Wonderful. Thank you, Matt. I will just share my screen here. Okay. Um, Hello, everyone. Let me start by thanking you again for hosting me at the Wilson Library last November. As we'll see, it was a productive month and really a transformative one for the dissertation. On the agenda for today's talk, I'm going to start by providing a short overview of the large-scale changes that I've made to the dissertation since returning to Athens. I'll talk a little bit about what emotions history is, and then provide a sort of 40,000 foot flyover of the dissertation. And I'll spend about half the time talking about, excuse me, highlighting some of the key findings from the Wilson Library. So what I have here are my original chapter titles pulled from my prospectus, and then my revised chapter titles post-Wilson Library. As you can see from the chapter headings, my original intent was for the dissertation to cover the entire period of Reconstruction. After my trip to Chapel Hill, I now think that the dissertation will largely focus on the period 1865 to 1869 or 1870. Based on my findings from last year, I've been able to expand that first chapter, The Other Era of Good Feelings, into 3 separate chapters. What was going to be chapter 2 about how the nascent Republican Party attempted to co-opt emotional norms first established by Andrew Johnson and prominent ex-Confederates, will now be the sort of fourth and final chapter, ending in about 1868. I did manage to pull a number of materials for these kind of prospective later chapters. but these later chapters will have to wait until the kind of disc to book transition. Okay. So what is emotions history? Emotions history is a relatively new subfield. While there was some excellent work in the kind of the 20th century, the contemporary field really only emerged after the publication of William Reddy's The Navigation of Feeling in 2001, which provided a framework for understanding the relationship between emotions and political power. In Reddy's view, emotions are culturally conditioned because the way that we um, describe emotions, of course, is cultural. The weight and the value that we give to particular emotions is culturally conditioned. And all states, monarchies, any form of government or authority needs to legitimize its power with kind of emotional control and policing emotional expression. How emotions function in Reddy's view is that these conditioned, these cultural ways of describing emotion, when you actually express yourself, do cultural work as well. The act of expressing an emotion functions like a sort of check that either, yes, this is truly what I'm feeling, reinforcing those emotions, or no, this is not what I'm feeling, prompting further exploration of your given emotional state. The next major innovation was Nicole Eustace's Passion is the Gale, which interpreted the pamphlet wars in the build-up to the American Revolution. She found that emotional performance was key to how individuals signified status, social status, but this changes in the build-up to the American Revolution as partly because of the spread of the evangelical religion, Americans developed a unique language of emotional expression that emphasized the essential equality of at least all white men. Michael Wood's Emotional and Sectional Conflict in the Antebellum United States is about precisely what the title suggests. Uh, Woods found that emotions were central to the development of sectional identities and encouraged antebellum Americans to take up arms in the Civil War. Following Eustace, he develops what he calls the affective theory of the Union, or this belief that 19th century Americans held um, that in a republic, citizens were held together by the horizontal bonds of fraternal love, as opposed to the vertical bonds that tied peasants to lords and kings. And sectional identities crystallized around these different emotional norms, including different political economies of happiness. Contentment in the South, which of course naturalized enslavement, and aspiration in the North, which naturalized industrial wage labor. So emotions, as I'm fond of saying, emotions are everywhere once historians bother to look for them. As I've kind of arranged here, Reconstruction is the next kind of logical step in the study of emotions in the 19th century. There's plenty of work on the revolutionary antebellum and Civil War areas, but no one has produced a monograph length study of emotions during Reconstruction. My aim is to show that at the heart of Reconstruction was a contest over emotional control. Who was able to establish new emotional norms following the Civil War, and how did these affect people's choices? So chapter 1 is an exploration of the first 2 years of Reconstruction, focusing on the emotional politics of Andrew Johnson's presidency. It primarily draws on Johnson's speeches and delegation meetings, but also the letters of Robert E. Lee, J.D.B. DeBow, and other prominent ex-Confederates. And it argues that Johnson attempted to use emotions to resolve some of the structural problems inherent in Reconstruction. The big political contradiction, was that ex-Confederates needed to be punished, but they also had to be made to accept their own punishment if any real sort of change was to happen. And Johnson creates this language around good feeling that attempts to ease some of that tension. This is also sometimes referred to as the kind of dual policies of peace and force. So Johnson's amnesty proclamation of May 29 was heralded as bringing in a new era of good feelings, similar to the presidency of Monroe. And good feeling quickly became the watchword of Reconstruction as Democrats, both North and South, picked up on this language to generate support for Johnson's approach to Reconstruction. It worked partly because it gave Southerners a lens with which to view the changes of Reconstruction. If something they felt, if there was a change they felt was too radical, they could slander it by saying that it alienated their feelings or it was designed to inflame Southern opinion, these kinds of things. Change became an affront to the good feeling that would supposedly bring the states back together. And the chapter culminates in a reassessment of the National Union Convention, here lampooned by Thomas Nast, but what was the sort of literal performance of good feeling as Northern and Southern Congress people and governors walked into the convention hall arm in arm, as we see here with Governor and Darius Crouch. So while mostly dealing with sources in and around Washington, the Springs family papers have three contrasting interpretations of the successes of the convention, two from Texas and one from Baltimore. The second chapter covers the same temporal ground, but asks questions at the local level. What I found is that while Johnson, Lee, and others were successful in creating this new emotional standard around good feeling, everyday people made use of it in quite their own way. The chapter covers three rough parts. The first are the tumultuous months after the Civil War, a time of fear and uncertainty as people tried to rebuild their homes, reunite their families, and grapple with what were often imaginary fears of northern tyrannical rule. And then how Johnson's amnesty proclamation starts to shift the gears away from fear and despondency and towards recalcitrance. It also covers some examples of Southerners trying to cultivate good feelings in themselves and others as they adjust to the changes of the Civil War. But I think by far the biggest section is what I refer to as the reconstruction of families, as families began to reopen lines of communication across sectional lines, communication which in some cases had been closed since the 1850s. And in these letters, people fought over the nature and consequences of the Civil War, but they also provide a look at the micro-politics of many spots around the South. As people got married, fought with their neighbors, rekindled their feelings for the Union, and tried to sort of stitch their families back together. All these things I've cheekily referred to as the emotional labor of Reconstruction. As I'll go over later, several collections at the Wilson Library provided material that allowed me to expand this into its own chapter. But one example is the Marguerite E. Williams papers, where a potential suitor in Louisiana wrote to Marguerite in Virginia saying, quote, "You say that a good many of the young ladies of Winchester have married Yankees. I hope that as good a rebel as you never will marry a Yankee," end quote. So Virginia women were cool with Northerners, but that wasn't the case in Louisiana, where they remained staunchly Confederate. And moreover, the author is trying to affect that loyalty to the Confederacy in others, in Marguerite, likely with a view to his own marriage proposal a couple of years later. Chapter 3 is an examination of race, sentiment, and labor, as Southerners attempted to navigate the free labor system. At least for the time being, this chapter is focused on Virginia, where I've been able to map out the state of feeling between the races at the community level, tying sentiment largely to labor market. So in this map here, which there are a couple of oddities, I'm not sure what's happening there, but this is just my proof of concept kind of for this method. Green dots are good, dark green dots are great, and the reverse is true for the red dots. So early in Reconstruction, this is the first months of 1866, this shows that over half of Virginia's communities were willing to accept the sort of changes brought by both emancipation and Reconstruction. In areas where there was a lack of labor or where freed people could engage in lucrative non-agricultural pursuits, planters provided emotional and material concessions to freed people. Freedmen's Bureau agents were also able to manage and promote positive feelings in large parts of the state. So there's kind of two routes for emotional navigation, either voluntary on the part of planters and farmers, or sort of with the aid of a northern interlocutor. Where the dots are reddest and where there's the greatest concentration of red dots tends to be in urban areas and areas where Virginians were able to turn freed people away from other areas of employment. So I know offhand this green dot here, this one here, and then this one up in the north, those all flip red after a Virginia oyster law prevented freed people from engaging in oystering. So there's this intimate connection between sort of labor supply and labor markets and the feelings that at least white Virginians were attempting to cultivate. The second half of this chapter looks at how planters responded. It's a sort of qualitative analysis to contrast these quantitative points. Many believe that there was an emotional bond between enslavers and enslaved people, which was sundered with emancipation. And many planters' writings talk about how to reforge that supposed bond in a free labor market. For instance, C.G. Meminger wrote to Andrew Johnson in support of a apprenticeship system, which would work because the freedmen were, quote, not yet alienated from them in their feeling, end quote. And this system of apprenticeship would feature, quote, generous applications by the one of his skill and resources and the kindly reception of the other, end quote. Emphasis here on the kindly reception. This new labor system that Meminger is proposing is not just about labor. It builds in the emotional management of the freed people, obviously against their own desires and interests. The final chapter covers the changes in the politics of emotion and the change from presidential to congressional Reconstruction. Johnson's rhetoric of good feeling was meant to speed the process of Reconstruction, largely to forestall larger changes like Black citizenship and Black suffrage. When Black suffrage was actually a possibility in 1867, ex-Confederates and other conservative Southerners abandoned the language of good feeling. To me, this is most prominent in the speeches of Benjamin Hill, while many have written about his 1868 Bush Arbor speech, which launches the Klan in Georgia. None have commented on the fact that it provided an emotional template or an emotional roadmap which Southerners could follow. Throughout the speech, Hill acknowledges his own fears many times at the end of the war and as Reconstruction progressed, but provided a series of moments when his fears slowly turned into pride as white Southerners rejected the process of Reconstruction. And the message is clear. I was afraid, now I'm proud. You're afraid, here's how you get your pride back. Contrasting this, while at UNC, I found in the Thomas Settle papers the text of his Spring Garden speech, which was a speech in 1867, which launches the Republican Party in North Carolina. In the text of Settle's speech, he co-opts the language of good feeling and attempts to present Republicans rather than Democrats as the party of emotional reconciliation. As the culmination of the dissertation, the chapter shows that Republicans attempted to adopt the emotional politics that appear to have worked for Johnson at the same moment that Democrats moved away from them. Many collections, but especially the diaries of David Schenck, will help me to look for how these different sets of emotional politics both supported the spread of the KKK and ended a period of emotional soul searching that lasted about 1865 to 1870. And what I mean by that is that within certain limits, white Southerners appeared to have actually engaged in a period of emotional reconciliation, navigation, in line with Johnson's call, but this period ends in 69 or 70. Further chapters will deal with the Klan question more fully, the question of why third-party movements failed, and the use of emotions in generating support for the violent overthrow of Reconstruction in 1876. While I have Wilson Library materials for these chapters, they will have to wait until I expand the dissertation from the book. So while I was at the Wilson Library, there were a few kind of grand slam collections. These are collections which will contribute to every single chapter. And I think the big one is the Springs family papers. The wealth of materials in the Springs family papers are really in the many people who wrote to A.B. Springs as opposed to his own letters. And the collection is a microcosm of the entire South, with folks writing from Maryland, Virginia, North Carolina, Louisiana, and Texas. And in their writings, which respond to things that Springs wrote, I can also glean some insights into South Carolina. As I've mentioned, one of the highlights for me were these reactions to the National Union Convention, but there are also many ruminations on the merits and hazards of free labor, accounts of ex-Confederates who start giving emotional political speeches to Black Texans, all of which signal that change kind of was possible during Reconstruction. There are also accounts of free labor in Virginia and North Carolina politics moving towards the center in 1868 as opposed to the fringes. The David Schenck diaries should provide material for every chapter. While I have about a dozen pages of notes, each of those portions should help me expand on those. In addition to his writings on emotions in the Klan and his own community, I believe he makes a comparison between the new Republican Party and the National Union Convention, which will help to kind of bookend the dissertation. And the Andrew Callum papers, similarly, he describes Reconstruction in Louisiana. He was pro-wage labor. He reopened a line of communication with a friend in Connecticut. He talks about the constitutional conventions of 1868, like really kind of something for every chapter. I've put collections 1 and 3, or chapters 1 and 3 together on this slide. Given their focuses on Washington and on Virginia, the types of materials which are relevant are a little bit more narrow, but still, I've already mentioned the C.G. Meminger papers, where he presents this system, a new labor system, which is built on a particular understanding of emotion. And the George A. Mercer diaries reveal that Mercer evaluated Northern political activity against a rubric of feeling, including when he wrote, feelings the circumstances were calculated to produce. So this idea that he thinks that Northern politicians are sort of accounting for emotions in their political action. So I think chapter 2, as I've indicated, was the chapter that changed the most, that I was able to collect the most amount of material for. I think the big find for chapter 2 is the Nicholas Philip Trist papers. The collection contains letters from 2 branches of the same family, one Unionist, one Confederate, but both in Virginia. The first branch, which is in Alexandria, largely accepts Reconstruction, and they set about to help rehabilitate returning Confederate soldiers, commenting on their emotional and political burnout. The other side of the family remains staunchly Confederate, but their letters tell about both a deep desire to reconnect with the Unionist branch of the family, but also the limits on that reunion. Their family members will have to accept that they will remain sort of loyal to the Confederacy as opposed to the Union. While I was focused on the non-digitized materials from the post-war period, I did find a misplaced letter from 1868, I think in the 1866 folders, which suggests that there's going to be workable material in the chunks that had been digitized. These other collections, Marguerite E. Williams, Sarah Lois Wadley, Elizabeth Hairston, all kind of function in a similar way in that they talk about really local and personal experiences of Reconstruction. Sarah Lois Wadley, for instance, is a great source on her own, again, imagined fears and despondency in the months after the Civil War. And this is a page from her diary on the slide. You'll notice she writes in her diary like a normal book before and during the Civil War. But during Reconstruction, you'll notice the page numbers at the bottom. She flipped her diary for some reason and was writing on the pages upside down, which I think is an interesting bit of evidence in itself, representing this view of like the world being flipped on its head. So each of these collections focuses on these like local micropolitics. They relate to one of the key stories in this chapter, which is two cousins who get married across sectional lines. William Cabell in 1865 began a courtship of his cousin Sarah from Illinois. They are married in 1867, but she almost calls off the marriage because she doubts the depth of his loyalty to the Union. And this, of course, produced several letters where he very grandly describes his loyalties and his feelings for the Union. So these themes of how families started to put themselves together all across the South during Reconstruction. Chapter 4 is really about this moment where Republicans try to co-opt the emotional rhetoric that the Democrats used at the same times that Democrats moved away from it. At the core of this chapter also is a look at the constitutional conventions of 1868, and each of these collections comments on those conventions. In the B.F. Perry papers, there is a great letter talking about how much average white South Carolinians actually liked the new state constitution and the tools that they would have for turning public sentiment in a different direction. That's this letter here, which, while great, unfortunately, we only have the first page of, and then the collection kind of skips to 18th. The Gregory and Elliott family papers tell about the acceptance of Union occupation as a political necessity, the acceptance of Black politicians in 1868, and references to Charleston's local politics, again revealing that like change was both possible during Reconstruction and often driven by emotion. And I found similar findings in the James Richard Hooker letters. The Fitzgerald family papers include the diary of a USCT soldier turned educator in North Carolina, and it's full of brief but really important descriptions of politics, racial violence in the Black community across Reconstruction in the state. So given the kind of wild success of finding manifold instances of these micro-level explorations of emotion, it might stand that the collections that didn't really work for me were the collections of prominent politicians. So, for instance, I spent a little too long on the Henry Clay Warmoth papers. My hope was that as governor, I would find similar material as I found in the Springs papers. People writing to Warmoth as their governor about their experiences and reactions to Reconstruction. But what I found was mostly correspondence relating to Warmoth's own political intrigues and political contests with Ulysses Grant. There were interesting letters where he talks about Reconstruction as a race against sentiment, but largely this did not work from an emotional angle. And similarly, papers of William A. Graham, Munson Monroe Buford, David Franklin Thorpe, all of which did not have those like local kind of letters to your governor, local experience that I had hoped for. During one of the days that the archive was closed, I compiled a list and some early notes on over 20 relevant collections that have been digitized. And aside from the Schenck diaries and these manuscript materials, I expect the D.H. Baldwin letters, William Royal papers, the D. Caradwick family papers, among others, to contribute to each of my dissertation chapters. So I have some stats up here. While at the Wilson Library, I looked at 36 collections, and I expect 29 will contribute to the dissertation, 8 of which have already made major contributions. And as I've indicated, the greatest amount of material relates to Chapter 2, which explores how Southerners made use of the language of good feeling in navigating the political and emotional challenges of Reconstruction during Andrew Johnson's presidency. The wealth of this material allowed me to take my first chapter draft and break it into 3 separate chapters, providing a more fine-grained and compelling argument in each. And the result is a reconceptualization of the contours and scope of the dissertation, which should make it easier to finish on time and also help in the dis to book transition. And this would not have been possible without this trip. So thank you very much, and I will pass it back to Matt.
Thank you so much. It's really interesting to see that sort of, I don't know that anybody sort of picked apart their original proposal. Well, we can talk about this later. I'm sorry, I was excited. So now we're going to talk with Sanjay. Sanjay also was kind enough to send me a brief biography. So Sanjay K. Paul is a doctoral candidate in the history department at Harvard University. He specializes in social, economic, and environmental histories of 19th century North America. He is currently researching and writing his dissertation, which analyzes the social and environmental history of emancipation in the U.S. South. His work has been supported by fellowships from Wilson Library, the John Now III Center for Civil War History at the University of Virginia, and the Dumbarton Oaks Museum and Library, among other institutions. So welcome, Sanjay.
Thanks, Matt. And thanks also to Nadia for setting up the event, and Jared for the chance to hear about your work. I don't have a presentation because I didn't want to subject anyone to just looking at documents that I spent way too many hours looking at, so hopefully my voice is entertaining enough. Let me get set up here. Okay. So it's really lovely to get the chance to tell the Wilson community about my time in Chapel Hill, because the Wilson was among the first archives that I visited for my dissertation. And it was the first at which I spent serious time thinking and trying to find answers to my questions. As such, it has deeply influenced my research. Records from the Wilson Library turned me away from my earliest, limited conception of my dissertation as an analysis of starvation caused by the Civil War, and toward my current approach, an analysis of how the Civil War transformed the landscapes of the Confederate South with great social consequence. Its collections have been and continue to be an immeasurable help. So during the next 25 to 30 minutes, I'll sketch out how and why the Wilson led me down this new path by talking you all through my experiences in particular collections. First, let me give you a sense of where I started. I began my time at the Wilson Library as I began my dissertation research in search of how the Civil War's material ramifications influenced the course of emancipation. Traditionally, historians of emancipation have identified the Civil War's military policy and political conflicts as the major milestones on the road to emancipation. Historians, such as those at the famed Freedmen and Southern Society Project, have argued that the First and Second Confiscation Acts, the Militia Act, and the Emancipation Proclamation punctuated the path to the 13th Amendment that abolished slavery. Their arguments were path-breaking, largely because they so persuasively formulated emancipation as a process, a transformation that was not an event, but unfolded unevenly over days, months, and years, even after the war. But their path-breaking efforts were also only a first foray into trying to outline and come to terms with this process. They left much out of their provocative essays, namely any reference to the Civil War's numerous material impacts, such as extensive deforestation, rampant animal diseases, the ripping up of railroad tracks, the destruction of barns and farmhouses, the confiscation of corn, wheat, and bacon, the disruption of coastal trade, and pest infestations, to name only a few. Such exclusions would have been fine and justified if these many material circumstances had not had obvious impacts on the experiences of enslaved men and women, among many other Southerners. but the limited evidence I had encountered in archives and secondary literature before I came to the Wilson told otherwise. Indeed, the material ramifications of war altered the course of events at several crucial moments. There were bread riots that rocked southern cities and transformed Confederate politics. There were pest infestations that thwarted the first experiments in emancipation in the Mississippi Valley and led to the Freedmen's Bureau food aid program. And there were foraging trains that sustained the advance of the U.S. Army into plantation districts. From these examples, it seemed to me that the common thread was that the Civil War led to starvation, but I couldn't find any explanations as to why. So, on the eve of my arrival at the Wilson Library, I tried to dig in and try to understand for whom the Civil War's material upheavals caused starvation, and how widespread starvation was, and how it shaped emancipation. So, in September, I made my way down to Chapel Hill, and after appropriately acquainting myself with the Carborough Farmers Market, Open Eye Cafe, and the biscuits at Neil's Deli, I hurried along to the archives. There, I learned rather quickly that the task ahead of me was a difficult one. Initially, the difficulty masqueraded as the classic problem of researching slaveholders' papers. They were not organized around the voices of slaves. I turned over letter after letter in the Springs family papers, and flipped page after page in the John Berkeley Grimble diary, among others, without much direct testimony from enslaved men and women about how they experienced the hardship of war. Scattered across these collections were many, as Thavolia Glimpf has briefly labeled them, paper tracings of slaves' actions and thoughts. I could, as Glimpf suggests, weave together stories like those of David's and Isaac's flight to U.S. lines in South Carolina, or Hagar's stealing from smokehouses in Mississippi, and the many conflicts over labor into a panorama of the experiences of the enslaved. Such a tour would testify to the great diversity of effects that the war had, in addition to widespread starvation, but it would sidestep my original question about how exactly the war unleashed starvation's different causes. So I decided that, in addition to the work of identifying who starved, I had to focus on and try to explain why the war produced circumstances that led to starvation in some cases and did not in others. So as the second week of my fellowship began, I shifted my focus to understanding what the arrival of armies meant and looked like. I quickly found intriguing results. Consider what happened at Ellen Louise Powers' plantation, just a few miles northeast of Port Hudson, in East Feliciana Parish, Louisiana. When the U.S. Army arrived in Powers' neighborhood, en route to besiege the Confederate stronghold at Port Hudson, they found all in the middle of spring rituals. Just a few days before, enslaved men and women had accompanied Ellen Power and her young slaveholding female companions on one of many early dewberrying expeditions. And only a few days afterward, on April 9th, 1863, Miss Shaddix had everybody over for the first fish fry of the year. Warfare had not yet touched the neighborhood around Clinton, Louisiana. During 1862, most of the fighting had occurred either to the south, in the environs of New Orleans, or far to the north near Corinth, Mississippi. So when U.S. and Confederate soldiers rolled in during late March, it was yet unclear what their presence would mean. But a pattern quickly emerged. As the U.S. and Confederate forces chased each other back and forth through the parish, Powers' plantation became a watering hole for both. On May 18th, 2 Confederate soldiers came from their nearby encampment to, quote, get milk. Just a few days later, 7 U.S. soldiers pushed through, quote, about 11 o'clock and took all the chickens and turkeys and even found the hidden preserves. Another batch of Confederates arrived the next day, hot on their tails, and, quote, took beefast, milk, and bread. So on and so forth it went during the spring and summer campaign for Port Hudson. Both sides became acquainted with and relied upon Power, and the corn, milk, vegetables, melon and dewberry preserves, and chickens that her slaves had either made or raised. Political loyalties did not seem to determine what would happen when armies arrived in slaveholding districts like the one that Power lived in. Instead, materials, and who controlled them, mediated so much of these fateful encounters. And Power, who commanded the labor of 13 men, 7 women, and 23 boys and girls, had many of the materials that armies required. Political loyalties were important, of course. Other collections at the Wilson, particularly C. Alice Reddy's diary, show their import spectacularly. Reddy's March 5, 1862 entry tells that as Confederate troops amassed in her Middle Tennessee neighborhood, a few Texas Rangers snuck onto her family's plantation to steal some corn. With her father out of the house and her mother sick, the teenage Reddy marched out to meet them, quote, without hat or bonnet, and found one in the corn house and the other and 2 in the garden. Reddy tells that she pled with them, quote, very politely, and they, quote, scampered off. A few days later, their commanding officer returned to apologize for his men's indiscretion in stealing corn from a, quote, loyal family. Clearly, loyalties could prevent the confiscation of necessities like corn, which would matter greatly during the coming difficult months ahead in Middle Tennessee. But overemphasizing political loyalties can obscure that both U.S. and Confederate armies encountered a highly unequal and rather complex slave society that depended on a particular agricultural landscape. Wherever these armies fought and marched, they altered the material configurations that underpinned slavery. By my second week at the Wilson, I came to understand that both slaves and slaveholders understood this very well. Eliza Hodges Sibley's letters to her daughter, Jane, reveal the material considerations of war extremely well. While Jane was away at boarding school in Marion, Alabama, Eliza wrote frequently and honestly about the difficulties that the slaveholding family faced near Raymond, Mississippi. U.S. and Confederate forces had been in and out of the area for well over a year when Eliza wrote to Jane in January 1864 that, quote, I have no doubt that we will have harder times this year than we have seen before, end quote. Eliza complained that they had no more corn or bacon left to, quote, feed the Confederate army. And when, the next month, rumors spread of a U.S. force of 30,000 poised to sweep the area, Eliza and her husband moved quickly to take the, quote, mules, wagons, and remaining corn out of the way of troops to avoid impressment and emancipation. Slavery was already teetering in the neighborhood, as slaves had been running away for the last 2 years in small groups at a time. Without the materials necessary to sustain the Sibley plantation, it would fall into disrepair, and so would their lives and power. Letters like the ones Eliza Sibley wrote to her daughter gradually helped me to realize how important the plantation landscape was to upholding slavery and slaveholders' power. The landscape was not merely a geography, or worse still, a background for human relations. The agricultural landscape of plantations defined the relationships between enslaved people and slaveholders. How human beings decided to shape the organization of living and dead plants, in addition to wild and domesticated non-human animals, was the story of how slaveholders enriched themselves through the exploitation of slaves. When the movement and clash of armies altered or removed this landscape, it provided the opportunity for the reconsideration of what slavery would mean and what it would look like. This understanding is what led Charles Pettigrew's mother-in-law in South Carolina to chastise her neighbor, Mr. Alston, who sought to refugee his slaves. When Alston told her that he would send his slaves from the Low Country to his summer home in the piney woods at Cherry Hill, South Carolina, to, quote, let them make provisions for themselves, Pettigrew's mother-in-law was aghast. She complained he might as well have proposed to take them to Liberia. She was upset that he would abandon, quote, the nicest crop in years during the fall 1861, and would compromise his domination of his slaves by allowing them control over new lands. By the middle of my trip to the Wilson, the materials that I had seen were beginning to force me to reformulate my approach. Although I had not yet encountered any evidence about starvation, I was not willing to drop the question yet, and indeed, later research trips would vindicate my instinct. Rather, I came to appreciate the research problem that I had to face. It was not merely the old, difficult problem of discovering the voices and actions of enslaved men and women in the archives. It was a matter of coming to terms with how warfare shaped their experiences of the destruction of slavery, principally through the problems it posed for the old routines that had defined material life on plantations. I hoped, and I still believe, that if I was able to scrounge up enough to create a sense of context, then I could appropriately explain and make sense of the paper tracings that enslaved men and women left behind in the archives. So, during my final 2 weeks at the Wilson, I turned towards some of the larger collections of plantation records, the Grimes, Pettigrew, Cameron, and Springs family papers. Matt had pointed these out to me, in his words, as, quote, some of the chattier collections of plantation records at the Wilson. And they certainly turned out to be. But in a classic twist of archival research, not about the subjects that I was in search of. I discovered the surprise rather quickly in the Grimes papers. I could not find much of anything about armies, impressment, or regular warfare. After all, these were records predominantly from the North Carolina Piedmont, which only became battlefront late in the war. So how could the Civil War have possibly had an effect on the landscape of plantation slavery there, an area that scholars traditionally describe as home front? Yet, as I did a final sweep before calling off my search in the Grimes papers, I began to run into some puzzling tidbits. First, there was a letter from the overseer Thomas Duran that complained, quote, there was a great cry for corn and meat in the neighborhood, and told of a local family in Pitt County that was, quote, starving and could not buy corn from any neighbors for the money. Then a letter from Spencer Grimke near Wilmington, who wrote pleading for aid that, quote, our forage is very bad about provision. Some weeks we are 2 or 3 days without anything to eat. And finally, another letter from Duran, reporting that slaves from a neighboring plantation had stolen one of Grimes's steers during the hard winter of 1864. It was never recovered and was likely roasted and eaten. Clearly, some different process was unfolding on the so-called home front that resulted in similar material upheavals in plantation life. I decided not to abandon the collections that Matt had suggested, and to use my remaining time at the Wilson to try to understand what exactly was happening and how it was related to faraway warfare. The most clarifying evidence I found was in the Cameron family papers. Paul Cameron's correspondence in those papers told the haunting story of life on his Greene County, Alabama plantation during 1863. Before the war began, his Greene County plantation was but one of 3 profitable plantations he owned that depended on the labor of slaves, the other 2 being in North Carolina and Mississippi. But as the war progressed, and the U.S. Army advanced down the Mississippi Valley during the fall 1862, Cameron made the gamble to try to protect his control over his slaves on his Senatoba, Mississippi plantation. On September 5th, 1862, Cameron's agent, Mr. Vick, left Senatoba to traffic slaves and mules all the way to Greene County. For half a month, 111 enslaved men and women marched over 200 miles. What they found in Greene County was hardly welcoming. Although far away, warfare cast a shadow on central Alabama. Bad timing made that especially clear. Just prior to the arrival of the men and women from Senatoba, the Greene County plantation had one of its worst harvests. During August, the overseer Wilson Obery wrote Cameron that a late summer drought of, quote, little to no rain left the corn, quote, all burnt up. The men and women at Greene County were able to salvage 150 acres of fodder for mules, hogs, and cattle, but the corn and potato crops that were supposed to feed slaves were all, quote, sorry. Obery assured Cameron that they will, quote, make a plenty anyhow, largely because of a bountiful pea crop from before the drought. But it was shaping up to be a series of hard months for the 104 slaves on the plantation, not to mention the 111 that were soon to join them. In normal times, Obery might have gotten more food for the men and women in his charge by buying from his neighbors. But the fall of 1862 was hardly a normal time, and Obery's reports reflect this. In the same August letter, he wrote, quote, I heard several planters say a few days since they have not had a mouthful of meat to give their slaves, and can't buy it for less than 50 cents a pound. Later letters confirm a pattern. In a March 22nd, 1863 letter, he wrote, quote, "This is going to be a hard year. Everything prices is very high." And still in June, he told that, quote, "Everything here costs about 3 prices." For some reason, I have yet to actually exactly discern, the Civil War caused a breakdown in the marketing of foodstuffs in southern and central Alabama. This pattern is consistent with problems that planters and slaves faced in North Carolina and in the North Carolina and South Carolina Piedmont and other plantation districts on the home front. So the suffering was not just the result of the drought. There are 2 probable culprits, and it is likely that both were responsible to an extent. The first likely cause of the high prices was the nearby presence of General Bragg's forces, stationed mainly along the coastal fortifications around Mobile, Pensacola, but also scattered on barricades along the Alabama and Tombigbee rivers. Bragg's quartermasters, as Aubrey tells it, quote, "pressed corn and meat now all through our country." I plan to conduct further research at the Alabama Department of Archives and History next fall to learn more about the exact effect of these station defenses. The second reason is a bit easier to see in the Cameron Papers. The U.S. naval blockade of the Gulf Coast had severely limited access to plantation articles usually purchased from the North or the world market. Salt was the most scarce of these goods. Used to preserve meat and other foodstuffs, it was essential for provisioning in the age before the supermarket and refrigerator, and was usually acquired from vast mines in Scotland. Cameron's correspondence reveals his wide writings to various factors in many different cities trying to secure it. When he was able to find some, it was horribly expensive and never enough. In one purchase in December 1862, Cameron asked Aubrey to sell 11 mules, needed for plowing and transport on the plantation, to buy just a few bags of salt. So, when the 111 people from Senatoba arrived in Greene County during late September 1862, they found little food and few means of preserving what there was. Unfortunately, the war's worst effects had yet to come. In the late spring, Aubrey wrote to Cameron to tell him that his hogs were, quote, "having bad luck." The next month, he reported that over 30 of his hogs had succumbed to, quote, "some disease," and his, quote, "neighbors have shared the same fate." Aubrey did not go into detail about the symptoms afflicting, quote, "more than half of his pigs," but there is no mistaking that it was the same disease that destroyed most of the hogs on Cameron's Senatoba plantation the previous year. After the war, the USDA would call this disease hog cholera, a highly infectious virus that clings to materials and lays dormant in preserved pork for months. Hog cholera was one of many animal diseases that ran rampant during and after the Civil War. Fostered by the close movements of peoples and animals on the battlefront, it was either transported to Greene County by the 111 enslaved people who marched from Senatoba, or transmitted across hog populations in the South during the intervening year. Either way, the outbreak of hog cholera wrecked what little prospects the 215 enslaved men and women had to eat during 1863. In the spring 1863, Aubrey wrote to Cameron, quote, "I will have a hard time for the next 4 months to feed my people and mules, but will try to keep all alive." Sadly, he did not succeed. While commanding the enslaved men and women to sow over 500 acres of corn, peas, and potatoes during the heat of the late spring and early summer, quote, "some sickness began to spread." By late May, the, quote, "sickness had claimed the lives of 3 enslaved children." Aubrey did not record their names. Instead, he hoped to save his job and assured Cameron, quote, "I don't want you to have the least doubts that your Negroes are not well attended to." And he deflected blame by claiming, quote, "I don't believe anyone knows what the sickness is." But in his next letter, he recorded the deaths of Richard and Willis, 2 more slaves, and in June reported the death of Peggy, The list of dead went on and on, but is likely incomplete due to missing letters from late July and August. He does tell that enslaved men and women were treating each other with, quote, hot tea made from local herbs. Obery later identified the sickness as typhoid pneumonia. I hope that additional research on that same neighborhood during 1863 will provide me with more evidence about symptoms with which I can compare these symptoms to those that modern epidemiologists have identified with typhoid pneumonia. But it is worth noting that typhoid pneumonia is a viral infection that, as my sister, an infection preventionist, tells me, can be fatal if a person's immune system is compromised by poor nutrition. In other words, the infection on the Greene County plantation that killed at least 10 enslaved people may have been so fatal because of the, quote, short rations that Obery was administering. The home front was therefore not exempt from the upheavals wrought by the Civil War. The tragedies on the Greene County plantation alerted me to some of the ways that the Civil War posed problems for plantation slavery far behind the lines of the Confederacy. Breakdowns in marketing, conflict between slaveholders and the state for resources, and the spread of animal diseases all proved a fateful combination for enslaved men and women. While the story on the Greene County plantation was different from the stories of those slaveholders and slaves who faced the arrival of armies, I began to notice similarities. The Civil War unseated the old landscape of plantation slavery. But depending on how and in what ways the Civil War transformed material life, it produced strikingly different results, ranging from starvation to opportunities to flee, to renegotiation of the meaning of slavery, and to death. I left the Wilson Library in late September struck by this realization. In subsequent months, I headed to the University of Virginia's archives, the Historical Society of Pennsylvania, and back to Harvard's archives. In each of these places, wherever I looked, I found more evidence that confirmed and expanded upon the lessons I learned at the Wilson Library. At UVA, I read quartermaster's reports that showed a pattern of slaves using plantation materials like mules and corn to leverage their way into U.S. Army camps. Before the Emancipation Proclamation, men and a few women brought horses, wagons, and corn to persuade soldiers to loosen the rules. At the Historical Society of Pennsylvania, I read of how the wreckage done to plantations tied ex-slaveholders to the land that they could not sell, and forced them to concede new rights and obligations to freed people who were fighting to make emancipation meaningful. At Harvard, I read wartime records that showed how a plantation landscape shaped by war guided the first experiments in emancipation at Port Royal and on Roanoke Island. Amidst this confirming evidence, I decided to reformulate my dissertation around a study of landscapes of war and their consequences for emancipation. The first half will explore how the landscape of war shaped the destruction of slavery, and the second half will explore the dialectical process of reconstructing the landscape and figuring out what emancipation would look like. This reformulation meant that I would have to exclude some of the material I consulted at the Wilson. I likely will not get to use the Grimes or Springs papers as extensively as I had hoped, as there will not be a chapter set in the North Carolina Piedmont. But I will depend heavily on other collections, especially the Cameron papers. What I got out of my time at the Wilson was more than the chance to look at an impressive array of archival documents. It gave me the chance to think seriously and build a better dissertation. Thanks.
Thank you so much. This has been really, really interesting to hear. So, do you all have questions for each other, or does anybody else have questions? Please, Sanjay.
I've got one for Jared. Yeah. I was just curious because you were talking a little bit about the differences in, researching in politicians' papers and trying to get this sort of on the ground feel that you were looking for. If you might just speak a little more about some of the challenges you faced getting down to the local level, and a little more than that of how what you discovered about ordinary people's engagement with sort of emotional framework of this period between 65 and 70, like how they were able to sort of contribute to that emotional framework and to what extent they were able to shape it and how.
Great. Yeah, thank you for that. And then I think I've got one for you as well after. I think methodologically, emotions kind of works on two levels. You've got a discursive or rhetorical level, and then of course this kind of like what did people actually do? As a social historian, I'm more interested in the people, but you kind of have to have both. Um, so I think so the challenges of getting at the local level, and then what did I discover? Um, I think the challenges are, I mean, the fact that folks just weren't literate in the 19th century, right? And even across the Civil War, the problem of transitional literacy stops us from um, getting a hold even on, I'm going to say sort of more like working class people. Um, the average experience of a Civil War soldier is better represented by a letter that's transitionally literate than a general, right? Um, so it's the same problem that I think all social historians face. I think what I've discovered is I don't know that they necessarily had the ability to help shape things at this discursive level, um, partly because they weren't the ones invited. Marguerite Williams wasn't the ones who was invited to give speeches, to submit columns to newspapers. They weren't newspaper editors. So there's a kind of institutional problem here that it doesn't necessarily flow upwards. At the same time, I did not find that folks were taking what Johnson and others had put forward as like this is how you should feel. They did not just take that and feel that. Rather, Johnson, Lee, DeBow, they kind of create parameters, and then people creatively work to their own ends within those parameters. And this is partly why I spent so long talking about families and why I'm so interested in families, is because that's kind of what people were doing. That's what they were getting emotional about. That's how they were interacting with this language of good feeling. So um, I usually have a joke that the Cabell cousins getting married, that's not what Andrew Johnson meant by good feeling between the sections. But I think that's for normal people. The work of Reconstruction was emotional, and it was in bringing your community and your family kind of back together. Again, getting to this idea of like in a republic, or a republic is held together by affect. Um, if that answers your question.
I, I have a quick thing just to as a possibility. One of the things that is unclear would be, so you're talking about Henry Clay Warmoth. One
Mhm.
doesn't really know the prehistory in terms of how those papers were kept and how things were discarded and
Mhm.
notions of history and importance that the family may have had. So I think one of the problems that social historians have is that structural problem of not being literate, not having the time to write, and all sorts of things like that, but also the dismissiveness, right, with which common people could have been viewed, just as a possibility for the silence that's there. Anyway, and I think you had a question also for Sanjay.
Uh, yeah. So I was thinking about this as you were talking about the breakdown in Civil War food markets was worse than a drought would have allowed. And throughout the paper, I was thinking about what's the kind of the relationship between weather and environment and this process of emancipation? Because it seems to me that the weather's unpredictable. 19th century people were probably worse at predicting the weather than we are, and that adds kind of an element of uncertainty to their lives, but then also to the kind of story that's something you maybe have to account for. And I was wondering if you had thought about weather and then how you separate out the caprice of weather from other things in your findings.
Yeah, that's a really good question. I mean, one of the things you learn very quickly when you spend a lot of time reading overseers' reports is that they're always stressed about the possibility of drought. Um, And just before, the point is not that it's worse than drought would have allowed for. I mean, it was a pretty bad drought. Armstead Robinson tabulated it in his book Bitter Fruits of Bondage, and this kind of crazy pre-computers mathematical calculation that he does. It's in the appendix. And the drought in southern Alabama is a reduction in rainfall amounts of like it's 20% of what it usually is in the average year. Of course, he sort of uses New Deal era averages, and then uh, I can tell you about it later. I mean, or you can read the appendix. So it's definitely an important part. Sort of the concerns that overseers have about weather is an important part of sort of the third chapter of my dissertation, which really looks at southern and central Alabama and the home front and the ways that there were sort of breakdowns on plantations. But I'm more interested in it doesn't seem ever really to affect their like the crops that they're planting. The concerns about crop planting are more about markets. So I mean, when they're no longer able to ship cotton out, one of the things that Obery does in 62 is sort of shift the plantation regime dramatically in the direction of corn, potatoes, and peas. And it doesn't seem to be a drought concern, even going into 63 when he's worried again about a drought. He doesn't decide to plant earlier or anything like that. He just spends a lot of time writing to Paul Cameron saying, "Oh no, we didn't get rain this week. Maybe it's happening again." Um, Insofar as what I'm interested in is paying close attention to the weather itself and how it actually affected the organization of these plantation landscapes. So the worries don't seem to affect that. So the worries kind of fall a little bit outside of what I'm looking at, I guess. If that answers your question.
Does anybody in the audience have a question for either Sanjay or Jared? I guess one of the things that is really interesting to me is when we devised these fellowships, the idea was that people were going to be asking complex questions that aren't readily extractable. And that seems to be the case in both of your instances. Um, I'm wondering, have you, what are the tells? I mean, we had conversations, Sanjay, about the density of conversation and things like that. What are the tells that you found most useful as you've moved from archive to archive, the descriptive tells that sort of suggest that something might be useful to you? You're also both involved in a considerable amount of deep reading, which is which makes a lot of sense. So maybe there aren't those sorts of things.
I mean, in terms of the collections of the Wilson, like I feel like I deal with a lot of different types of material as I'm reading like quartermaster's reports and at a certain point I don't really feel like I've got a good sense of looking at a finding aid, how to tell what's going to be useful and what's not going to be useful. I feel like oftentimes I just kind of jump in and see. One of my supervisors says that if you aren't learning a new thing after 3 days, put that collection down, move on to another collection.
Hmm.
But in terms of using plantation records uh, to do sort of fine-grained social history and get down to the events of ordinary life, the correspondence has always been really great, but particularly trying to figure out the relationship that the primary person whose letters are being collected has with different people, because they're going to be talking about different things with different people. Like I mentioned Charles Pettigrew's mother-in-law. I still don't really know what the relationship had, what the relationship was like, but for some reason they were always talking about the most intimate affairs. And I found that really fascinating. Or there's another collection I looked at in the Peabody Essex Museum in Salem, Massachusetts. This is, I think, the most striking example was a young man who was leasing a plantation in Mississippi in 1864 as a part of this Treasury Department program. And his letters to his father were like curt, to the point, usually triumphant about the nature of business. And then his letters to his mother were like 4 times the length went into detail about all of his feelings and what was going on in his life and the sort of minutia of the plantation. And so if you can kind of identify, where people are sort of spilling the beans, and or sort of who they're spilling that stuff to, be the best
Yeah.
answer I could give.
Thanks. Do you have any ideas, Jared? I mean, I know you have ideas.
Yeah, I mean, I think Sanjay's got it. I when I'm looking for something, or when I'm looking at a finding aid, I'm looking for correspondence between family members. Um, Individual descriptions, I'm assuming emotions aren't things that are often cataloged. So I'm not typically looking for, these are very expressive, although that's welcome when it shows up. So family correspondence, and then really just any mention of social interaction, communities, or politics, I feel like I have to take the chance on it. With that said, I think I've had the most success, and this is sort of similar to Sanjay, where family members are of equivalent status writing to one another. So fathers and sons, I actually rarely get something good. But when it's cousins, when it's siblings, so I get the most honest letters when it's people at a similar sort of place in their life or within their family writing to one another. There are exceptions, but that's what I look for, is like letters, big collections with letters between brothers, that kind of stuff.
Yeah, yeah. That makes an awful lot of sense. I mean, when we're working with students, we're always talking about the context in which something is both written and received or expected to be received, and what that tells you about candidness and sort of verbosity and things like that. Well, I think we're at about time if people don't have any further questions. I really enjoyed hearing about what you did here. It's sort of an odd position that we're in. We get materials, we have conversations, but we really don't know what you're doing. So it's always a nice moment to step back. Did you, I guess the last thing that I'm curious about is when you went home and you both had serious reconsiderations of your project, um, I assume that is greeted with sort of knowing looks and understanding that this is how it happens when you have an idea of what you hope to find, and then you have the reality of what you're able to find. And sometimes that results in revisiting some things. Good.
Matt, we do have a note in the
Oh,
Q&A if you want to read that.
yeah. Thank you. Um, oh, here's a question. When comparing collections, make sure to notice patterns in one collection that are missing in others. There is significantly less correspondence in the Cameron family papers with overseers than in other collections. There are zero mention of discipline of slaves in any surviving letters. That lack of information tells us a lot about what happened before those letters made it to the archive. I wonder which one of my colleagues was writing that. Thank you. That was a very good comment. I think it's true. You need to pay attention to the materiality and think about the context of the creation of the archive as a part of your work. Well, thank you both. I guess, again, as we sort of began our conversation before the webinar, please stay in contact. Let us know about your successes and materials that you're publishing. And also, if you're going to be back in town and you need to come and visit us, or if you need anything from us, please do reach out. And tell your colleagues we're also going to offer the fellowships again this year, of course. So tell your colleagues to give us a good hard look. So thank you all. Thanks everybody for coming, and we'll see you in the fall.
Thanks, Matt. Thanks,
Thanks, Phil.
Maddie.
Yeah.
Thanks, Jared.